The microphone hit the desk with a soft thud. 30 million people watching from home heard it. The band fell silent mid-note. Doc Severinson's trumpet hung in the air, waiting. Ed McMahon turned his head slowly, confusion crossing his face. Johnny Carson, the man who had delivered a monologue every weeknight for 17 years without missing a beat, had just stopped talking. His hand moved to his tie, adjusting it once, then twice. He wasn't looking at the camera anymore. He was looking at someone in the third row. An elderly man in a dress uniform covered in ribbons sat perfectly still, his right hand raised in a military salute. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't moving. He was just there, holding that position, as if waiting for permission to lower his arm. Carson's lips parted, but no joke came out. No punchline. No smooth transition to the next segment. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes a television audience at home lean forward and turn up the volume, wondering if something went wrong with the broadcast. But nothing was wrong. Something was about to go very, very right. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. 3 hours earlier, the NBC studio had been buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Stagehands adjusted lights. The band ran through the opening number. Carson sat in his dressing room, reviewing cue cards with his head writer. It was February 1983, a cold Tuesday night in Burbank. Just another episode of The Tonight Show. Just another crowd filing into Studio One. Among them was Harold McKinney, 71 years old, wearing a navy dress uniform that still fit him the way it had in 1945. His daughter had convinced him to come. She'd written to the show 3 months earlier, explaining that her father had served in the Pacific Theater, that he'd been at Iwo Jima, that he'd watched friends die on beaches whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted her father to see Johnny Carson live, before it was too late. The show's talent coordinator had read the letter twice, then passed it to Carson's producer. By the end of the day, Harold McKinney had 2 tickets to The Tonight Show, third row center. He didn't know why they'd given him such good seats. He didn't ask questions. He just polished his medals the night before and made sure his uniform was pressed. When Carson walked onto the stage that night, the applause was thunderous, as it always was. He waved, smiled, took his place behind the desk. The monologue started clean. Jokes about the weather. A bit about Congress. A story about Ed's weekend. The audience laughed right on cue. Everything was running like clockwork. Then Carson glanced down at his notes, and saw something that wasn't supposed to be there. A handwritten note from his producer, folded and placed on top of the cue cards. He picked it up, read it quickly, and his expression changed. Just for a second. Then he folded it, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and kept going with the monologue. But something had shifted. Those who knew him well, the people who worked with him night after night, saw it immediately. His rhythm was still perfect, his timing still flawless, but there was something else now. A weight. An awareness. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. He put the cue cards down, reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded note and read it again, this time out loud. "There's a gentleman in our audience tonight," Carson said, his voice quieter than usual. "His name is Harold McKinney. He's 71 years old. He served in the United States Navy during World War II. He was at Iwo Jima." The audience didn't applaud. They didn't react at all. They just listened. Carson looked up from the note, scanning the third row. "Mr. McKinney, would you stand up for us?" Harold hesitated. His daughter touched his arm. He rose slowly, his back still straight despite the decades, despite the scars no one could see. The studio lights found him. The camera swung over. America saw him. And then Harold McKinney did something no one expected. He lifted his right hand and gave Johnny Carson a full military salute. Sharp. Precise. The way he'd been taught in 1943. Carson stood up. Not the casual, mid-interview stand he sometimes did when a joke landed perfectly. This was different. This was instinctive. He stood, and for a moment he didn't move. He just looked at this man, this stranger who had fought in a war before Carson had even started his career, and something inside him broke open. Doc Severinsen put his trumpet down. Ed McMahon's eyes glistened. The audience, 300 people packed into that studio, sat in complete silence. Carson walked out from behind the desk. No one had told him to do this. No producer had scripted it. He just moved, crossing the stage, stepping down into the audience. The cameras followed him. 30 million people watched. He stopped in front of Harold McKinney. The old man still held the salute. His arm hadn't wavered. Carson looked at him for a long moment, then lifted his own hand and returned the salute. Not as sharp. Not as practiced. But with everything he had. Then he dropped his hand, stepped forward, and hugged him. The studio erupted. Not with applause. With something deeper. A collective exhale. A release. People stood. Some wiped their eyes. The band didn't play. They didn't need to. This moment didn't need a soundtrack. Carson pulled back, his hands still on Harold's shoulders. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you for your service. Thank you for what you did." Harold nodded. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Carson stayed there for another few seconds, then patted Harold's shoulder twice and walked back to the stage. He didn't run. He didn't rush. He just walked slowly, deliberately, giving himself time to pull it together. When he sat back down behind the desk, he didn't pick up the cue cards. He just looked at the camera. "We'll be right back," he said quietly. The show cut to commercial. In the studio, no one moved. Harold McKinney sat back down, his daughter holding his hand. The band members stared at their instruments. Ed McMahon wiped his face with a handkerchief. Backstage, Carson made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. During the commercial break, Carson walked off the set. Not to his dressing room. Not to talk to the producers. He walked back into the audience, found Harold McKinney, and sat down next to him. For 2.5 minutes, while America watched commercials, Johnny Carson sat in the third row of his own show and talked to a veteran. No cameras. No microphones. Just two men, one who had fought in a war and one who had spent his life making people laugh. When Carson returned to the stage, the show continued. He interviewed a young comedian. He did a sketch with Ed. He played a game with the audience. But everyone in that studio knew something had happened that couldn't be undone. A line had been crossed. A moment had been created that was bigger than the show, bigger than the format, bigger than the jokes. After the taping ended, Carson did something he rarely did. He stayed. He didn't leave immediately, didn't retreat to his dressing room. He stood at the edge of the stage and shook hands with audience members as they filed out. When Harold McKinney reached him, Carson didn't just shake his hand. He walked him and his daughter out to their car. Personally. The biggest television star in America, walking through a Burbank parking lot at midnight with a 71-year-old veteran. Before Harold got into the car, he turned to Carson one more time. "You didn't have to do that," Harold said. Carson shook his head. "Yes, I did." The next morning, the phone lines at NBC were flooded. Letters poured in. Thousands of them. Veterans writing to say thank you. Families writing to say their fathers had cried watching the show. Teachers writing to say they wanted to show the clip in their classrooms. The clip never aired again on The Tonight Show. Carson made sure of it. Not because he was ashamed. Because he didn't want it to become a gimmick. He didn't want it replayed until it lost its meaning. That moment belonged to Harold McKinney. It belonged to the men and women who had served. It didn't belong on a highlight reel. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. 3 years later, Harold McKinney passed away. His daughter sent a letter to Carson. In it, she included a photograph. It was a picture of her father, taken the night of the taping, still in his uniform, standing in front of the NBC sign. On the back, in Harold's handwriting, were 4 words: "Best night of my life." Carson kept that photograph in his desk drawer for the rest of his career. He never showed it to anyone. He never talked about it in interviews. But people close to him knew it was there. And they knew that on difficult days, when the grind of nightly television felt too heavy, he would open that drawer and look at it. The ripple effect of that night extended far beyond Studio One. Within weeks, other veterans began writing to the show. Not asking for recognition. Just sharing their stories. Thanking Carson for remembering them. One letter came from a man who had served in Korea. He wrote that he'd been watching with his grandson that night, and for the first time in 30 years, he'd been able to talk about the war. The salute had opened something in him that had been locked away. Another letter arrived from a widow. Her husband had died in Vietnam. She'd kept his medals in a box in the closet for 15 years, unable to look at them. After watching Carson honor Harold McKinney, she took them out. She framed them. She hung them in her living room. She wrote to Carson, "You helped me remember that his sacrifice mattered." Carson read every letter. He didn't respond to all of them, but he read them. And each one reinforced what he'd felt that night on stage, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop talking and start listening. Stop performing and start witnessing. Years later, after Carson retired, a young late-night host asked him for advice. Carson told him about the ratings, the writers, the pressure. Then, at the end of the conversation, he told him about Harold McKinney. "Don't forget," Carson said, "that the people watching aren't just an audience. They're human beings. They've lived lives. They've fought wars. They've lost people. They've survived things you and I can't imagine. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is stop the show and acknowledge that." The young host nodded. He thought he understood. But he didn't. Not really. Not until years later, when he faced his own moment, his own choice to stop the script and be human. That's the legacy Harold McKinney left behind. Not just a moment on television. A reminder. A lesson. That entertainment isn't just about laughs. It's about connection. It's about recognizing the person in the third row who fought for your freedom to stand on that stage. Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years. He interviewed presidents, movie stars, musicians, legends. He told 10,000 jokes. He created a format that defined late-night television. But when people who were there that night in 1983 talk about Carson, they don't talk about the jokes. They talk about the salute. They talk about the hug. They talk about the moment he stopped being a host and became a human being. Harold McKinney's uniform is preserved in a military museum now. His medals are displayed in a glass case. But the moment he shared with Johnny Carson lives somewhere else. It lives in the memories of everyone who saw it. In the letters that still arrive at NBC decades later. In the story that gets passed down from one generation of television makers to the next. Because that night, Johnny Carson did something that no script could have written and no producer could have planned. He stopped the show. He crossed the stage. He honored a man who had never asked to be honored. And in doing so, he reminded an entire country what respect looks like. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The photograph is still there, tucked away in an archive somewhere. Harold McKinney in his dress uniform, standing tall, smiling. 4 words on the back. Best night of my life. Carson never aired that footage again. He kept it locked away, protecting it from becoming just another clip. Because he understood something most people don't: the greatest moments aren't meant to be replayed. They're meant to be remembered. That night, 30 million people watched a talk show host become human. And one veteran finally heard the words he'd waited 40 years to hear. Thank you.